Batu, Barada, Nikto.
You must remember those words.
Gordon's alive.
You know what the Turing test is?
I know Kung Fu.
Dead or alive, you are coming with me.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Stories Out of Time and Space. I'm your regular host, Scott Weatherly, and as always, I am with my fellow scientist thrown to another planet, Julian Darius. Julian, how are you doing? You okay?
I'm doing all right. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Yeah. This week we talk about Hard to Be a God, the Russian film from 2016. 2015, yeah.
2013. It was worked on for a long time.
Oh yeah, this film. I looked at some of the history and the guy who I'm going to struggle to pronounce some names and stuff, which I'm going to try and cover off. But started making this, died before it was completed, which is tragic. And he friends, or I think it was his son actually, completed the sounding and a load of other stuff and the editing. So
yeah. The filming lasted from 2000 to 2006.
Yeah,
and then the movie was finally released in 2013. And he Alexei German wanted to make this movie for like decades before that. Like, what is going on?
Well, it's based on a novel that was written by the same guy that wrote Roadside Picnic, which became Stalker. And so it has a similar sort of origin. But yes, released in 2013. 2 hours and 57 minutes long. That includes credits, I would say.
You say that with Scott with such venom in your voice, like
we shall get Julian, to it.
Yeah. So what the viewers should know, the listeners should know, is that I woke up to an email from you that said, I'm 30 minutes in. What the hell is this?
What the hell am I watching? This is a fascinating yet grueling film, is the only way I can describe this. I would say, Alexei German is the director, and I'm not gonna credit names because there's a lot of sort of Russian names I would butcher, so I will put some names out there. But let's give a very brief premise of what this film is, because it is based on a novel, and I'm assuming the novel sort of heeds closer to a narrative being a different thing. So the story is, it's set in a distant future, and scientists, it says quite a lot. I mean, at one point it suggests like dozens of scientists have gone out into space, and
like 3 dozen is the narration, right?
Yeah. And they have found a planet that is very much like Earth, but is about 800 or so sort of years past of our history. And so is sort of like a medieval period. And is about to, or could possibly be on the verge of its renaissance. However, they find that instead of welcoming the Renaissance, these people are executing intelligent, these people not intelligent, but these people of education that can read. They refer to them as smart asses, or
wise ass.
Wise ass. Yeah. Oh, is the American smart ass is what they call them in the British thing. And
the British subtitles are different from the American.
Yeah. Okay. And so they are denigrated and executed. They are hung, but not just sort of men, women, and children are depicted in this. And what this film follows is one of these scientists, as he basically goes through a period of time before the castle he lives in is attacked by, they call them the Order, and how he is unable and incapable of basically preventing the attack that's about to happen. So he just sort of visits all these friends and these people he's got to know. That it? That's sort of it, I think, in a nutshell.
Yeah. Roughly. I mean, I think that essentially he he's tricked by his friend. It winds up being his
Yeah.
friend who shoots his. He has a lover who's
Yeah.
pregnant with his child. It seems, and basically, it seems is like in parenthesis for everything we're going to say about this movie, every single statement. But it seems as if his friend has killed with a crossbow bolt the lover in order to make him go off and attack the order, which he then does.
But that
and
does
he
not
winds up
happen.
killing a lot of people.
But that does not happen until about
Very
late into the film. The rest
yeah.
of the film is him traveling around this castle area, meeting
dealing with
different people. Yeah, dealing with
mostly
different
he's
kinds
wandering around, and it like just is like the feel of a medieval village, but also like very alien. And I think it kept reminding me of Vim Vendors or something. Just like very, it's very rare that you get like really dirty depictions of the Middle Ages. Everybody wants to do it, right? But like this is like this is probably taking it too far. It's just all the streets are mud. Everything is filthy. I mean, it certainly makes an impression.
Oh, this film, I don't want. I wouldn't say I've got a cast iron stomach, but this I had to stop at one point because this film made me feel physically sick.
I'm so happy to hear that. That's so. I wish I could say the same.
Yeah.
But there are a few points. There's a point later on where he is examining where the guts are falling out of a person. Not the only time that happens, and he is holding their still beating heart. That I was like, wow, like this looks really good, actually.
Oh yeah.
Especially given the budget of a few million over 6 years, and it looks amazing. The black and white really makes everything look extra gritty, and you can hide low budget better. Everything, it really is remarkable.
The two bits, so it was a bit of a build up, I would say, that led me to feeling nauseous. Because you are right. This is possibly one of the dirtiest, grimiest films I have ever seen. And I am going to praise this film shortly. Don't worry, I am. But so there's a number of things. But one of the things I felt about this film is it's both, the environment is expansive and claustrophobic at times as well. And whenever he goes inside, and I want to talk about the technicality because that's where I'm going to give this film huge praise. It feels incredibly claustrophobic, and I was laying on my sofa watching this film, and I had to watch it. I was watching it on a tablet actually. I was watching it, so it was quite close up with headphones on because no one else in the house wanted to watch this, surprisingly. This Russian medieval film, black and white. So I was watching it. But this thing of when he's in, there's a part and there's a he keeps going inside, but it felt very claustrophobic. And there's all these chains and there's these ropes hanging down. It just feels dirty.
And it was animal carcasses hanging everywhere.
Yeah, exactly.
And
it's just
there's
everything
just debris on everything, and every surface is like wet.
Yeah,
and it's not like wet with like spit, and it's not
visceral.
And
like people, people spitting and blowing snot out the nose all the time. But it built up to that film, and when he was just sort of touching, and it made me feel nauseous. And then it gets up to, and this can sound weird, but there's a scene where right towards the end, I'd lasted quite a while, but there's a scene towards the end, and he goes to, and there's a you've seen all these dead bodies hanging, which is also incredibly well done. It really is quite disturbing. But there's a scene where two women have been tortured to death using large wooden penis stakes. Is the only way I can describe.
Yeah, spikes.
Yeah,
right.
And at one point he's leaning on one, and the guy just says, basically one guy says, just so you know, this is her insides. And she's there. She's still moaning. She's still alive. And he basically just grabs it and he's like, oh, it's gooey. And then wipes it across his face.
Oh, yeah.
And all of a sudden, that was where the point where my body went, like cumulatively across the film, my body just went, no, we need to do,
Nope,
yeah, literally, like he opens his eyes and it's sort of dripping, and my body, like literally, my stomach went,
yeah.
can we take a breather?
It's sort of like black goo. It's like almost tar.
Yeah, but
And it's a brilliant shot. Like he
it
wipes
is.
it on his face, and then his eyes open, and his eyes are so white.
Yeah. But my stomach just went, yeah, we need a break. Get some water, take a breath, come back and finish this off. And it really did. Like, and so that no film has made me do that ever.
Wow.
And that so this film is a milestone in that it
5
physically
stars just for that. I mean,
yeah.
Well,
We'll talk
I think
about
most people in their ratings, where they talk about like plot, acting, they give Academy Awards. One of them is for, can I produce visceral disgust? And I think if you've accomplished that, there's a part of me that just goes like, okay, you default into a 5-star rating just for being able to claim that.
I went into this film as cold. I often try to do this with films, and we've talked about this a few times, of going into a film cold. I did it with Tokyo Gore Police, and I kind of enjoyed some of that stuff. I thought there was some great stuff in that. But I went into this knowing I know what the plot is, I know what the synopsis is, I know what the blurb is, and that's enough. And I know what this is, and I'm going in thinking, yeah, the last time I watched a long Russian film was Solaris, and actually kind of enjoyed that. I thought it was good, and it still carries with me. This is going to carry with me in a very different kind of way, but.
They're both, the thing is, they're both really memorable films, and they're both kind of hard to get through at times. And have long sequences that you think, I'm not sure why this sequence made it into the final cut. But, I would say, like, I started this film very sort of like nonplussed, sort of like, okay, I don't really, there's this narration, but the narration tells you very little.
Yeah.
And then it really isn't even until like halfway through that you realize, like, oh, he's been sparing everybody in these duels and cutting off their ears, and there's all this dialogue, or he's like, oh well, that still hurts, and he's trying to save face and hide the fact that he's from Earth, right? And people consider him a god, so the title is both, he's a god because he's from Earth and knows lots of stuff, but also he's a god because in the 20 or 30 years that he's been there, 20 years, something like that, a rumor has started. However, he's a sort of aristocrat, a baron, and a rumor has started that he is the son of one of their gods.
Yes, and he has built this up. He's allowed this rumor, but not only has he allowed this rumor to spread, he's actually fed into it by wearing certain things and always being incredibly wearing these white shirts and stuff. Like, so he's
and
made
this crystal on his forehead. Like,
yes,
the costuming is amazing. So like right away, the first thing that I like is I like the cinematography. It's all these long cuts, just fantastic long cuts through, as you say, like this kind of claustrophobic, dirty medieval, I mean, if you think that like Star Wars and Alien is like a used, dirty future, wait till you see this, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, oh my Lord. And you're right, everybody is spitting. The number of times where just like mud is on people's faces or thrown at somebody, and then you realize it's quite likely it's shit. Everybody is sniffing things, going like, it smells like shit. It's very disgusting and very wet and very dirty. And
well, it's one of those films.
I'd say the first hour is just kind of like more about that experience, right? And,
I think the whole film is. I would say, yeah.
I think so too, but I'd say it takes me like about an hour until I settle in. Well, maybe like by half an hour, I'm like, okay, I'm just enjoying the ambiance at this point. Like, I know European cinema. I know what this is, right? Like, I'm enjoying the ambiance, the feeling. This is about that feeling more than it is the plot, right? And it's not going to give me those usual things, right? I mean, I've seen Fellini. I can get through it, right? But then by about the half point, I'm actually like really kind of mildly riveted, like I'm actually like in a plot, and I'm worried about what's going to happen. And, at that point, it becomes clearer, that he's sort of like resisting taking any action, and he's trying to rescue these people who are sort of intellectuals and poets and people like that. There's more of a clear plot, even though it's sort of hidden, right? It's hidden in this sort of dialogue where every line of dialogue is a non sequitur. It's an alien culture, um, but I interrupt.
No, because you're right. I think that's the thing. This film is not. You say about the plot. Like, I had to work really hard to get to understand. Like, so the finale of the film. Yeah, you say because I think you need to sort of understand the ending to understand the rest of the film, the what came before it, really. So you're right. So there's this woman you've met several times, and she keeps saying to him, "You need to take me to a doctor so I can be proven that I'm pregnant," and all this other stuff. And he's like, "Yeah, whatever." And it's sort of, "We'll deal with it." And it's all very sort of like odd, as many things are. But she is then killed, by a bolt through the face or by the back of the head. And it sort of it becomes it, but you never see the battle. Like, there is no battle. It just becomes the aftermath. Everything, the order is coming, or is there. They are mentioned throughout the film. This thing of the order, very much maybe like like the Spanish Inquisition or this anti-intellectual thing. They are there to sort of prevent smart asses and this other thing. And so all you get is the aftermath of this battle, and then you obviously find out, as you say, about this other person that sort of seems to have set it up. But that's it. Like, it's not like, and what I find fascinating is, it's not like, say, a Lord of the Rings where you're leading up to the Battle of Helm's Deep or anything like that. Like, the battle happens off screen. It's a sort of almost like a smash cut between this happens and then bump. There's a kid rummaging around through dead bodies, looking for bits and pieces. Like, it's really sort of like keeps punching you in the face, but you've got to keep up with what's going on. But one of the things I find that's more fascinating about this is the plot, knowing the environment and knowing the world that it's set in, which is sort of, I get that. So one of the things I start to learn, rather than the plot to me was irrelevant. And you know how character driven and plot driven I am. That was irritating the crap out of me. So by an hour in, I was really struggling. I'm going like, he keeps going from shithole to shithole. I don't know what's going on. Like, where is this leading?
He mostly seems to be wandering around, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's not even clear, and interacting with people in non sequitur sort of ways. And yeah, I can see the frustration.
But there are lines that keep popping up and like tickling my ear. And there was one in particular that really got to this whole thing of the anti-intellectual. So these, like you said, the poets, the intellects being killed off. And their families, I should highlight, not just them, but they highlight at one point their families. Like, they're not living anything to chance. There's a guy who, I'm not sure if he's a priest or what he is, but he starts saying to the main character that you can breathe free. You can breathe better in a free Dakar, which is the name of the town or this castle city. And it's this idea that because they're killing off these intellectuals, like it's a free city. There's no oppression. We are a free place. This idea of freedom. And I was thinking, what is this film being made in response to? Is it an anti-communist film? Is this sort of like a post, communist film of sort of like, or actually this feels very much like the joke Bill Hicks does about being, well, we got ourselves a reader, that sort of anti-intellectualism of being free, but like not being made to look stupid. And so there was these little moments throughout that really, the humor is continually sort of bodily function. It's base humor, like there's fart gags and like not to be funny. Like, the jokes aren't supposed to be funny, but it's like people interacting with fart jokes and like you say, and literal filth. And so they're supposed to be shown to be ignorant and stupid. And I'm going like, I get what's happening here, but I'm grasping at things in a good way. I like part of the challenge, but I so much needed something else.
No, I know what you mean. I mean, I'm a writer, and I mean, a fiction writer, and I would always tell somebody who's writing, like, make the plot clear, right? If your audience doesn't know the plot, it's a problem, right? But of course, there are always exceptions to every rule. And obviously European cinema is a little more willing to forgo those kinds of rules. So yeah, I mean, I share that kind of frustration. um I do that thing about the fart
Mm.
jokes and all this sort of thing is it's probably the best representation I've ever seen of medieval humor.
Mm.
Like medieval humor is very crude and very stupid, and even though it's all pious religious nonsense, it's filled with like the Miller's Tale and all the medieval writing is like its concept of humor is like and then he fought it. It's like the
Base, yeah, kind of
Canadians
stuff.
from
Yeah.
South Park or
Mm.
something.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
mean, at one point,
it's really dumb.
in also very sort of genital based, like at one point
Hmm.
someone grabs his cod piece, and they're like,
Hmm.
"Oh, well, you've actually got a penis, like you've actually got one, like unlike the bishop kind of thing." And you're like, there's all these kind of things going on, and like you said, because they're non sequiturs, I'm like, that's got no context. Like I have no idea if that's like a
Yeah.
inside joke or whatever. Like you don't know, you're not supposed to, I suppose. But yeah.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, and I think it's this idea that, we talked about with the Godard film,
Mm.
of sort of like this is a foreign society where its cultural references aren't yours, right?
Yeah.
And so of course you're going to be kind of lost. And I really like that. Um, I mean, the number of times where somebody grabs somebody's, penis is, really remarkable. It's like I found myself thinking of like I really like the movie Sin City, but having seen it with people who were not comic book people, I was like, there is that sort of like, okay, the number of times that a face is pushed into a toilet,
Yeah.
that has stuff in it is maybe too many times, right? The number of
Yeah.
times where somebody's crotch is grabbed. But then I did find myself thinking, and I think this is very accurate, and I don't think we usually see it, of this idea of just sort of how cheap life was.
Mm.
And, yeah, people love their kids and people, want to stay alive. But, the like the slaves you see, um, the constant presence of just death and disease and just one of the things that I always object to in every depiction of the Middle Ages is like straight teeth. Everybody is 6 foot tall and if
Yeah.
they have straight teeth and their faces look like our faces. No, they all had diseases. They all had the teeth were rotten. And it's not to say that medieval people had no concept of hygiene or anything else, that is exaggerated, but they're, they had acne scars and everything else. And you really see that here. I don't even know where they found all these actors. Like, it's
Well,
amazing.
that's something I wanted to highlight. There's two things from what you've said there. Is there's three things I want to quick to. Two are very connected. But the first thing is this idea of filth, and you've said about this depiction of the Middle Ages. Some of it's quite accurate. That's an actual castle that I think was in. It was not Russian. It's somewhere else. But they've done this thing. But there's a scene where there's a guy. You'd literally see a lavatory. So and all is true. There would be a wooden box on the
Mhm.
outside of the castle that was basically with a hole in it that they just defecate through, and that was it. And it would just land on the floor. And then it was someone's job to take that away. That was the job. And you see one of these guys, and he's there, sort of like, but he's using his hands to shift stuff and all this other stuff. And you hear all this thing that's going on. Like I said, this level of filth, and you see these people. At the very opening of the film, is a woman being carried away, and the suggestion is that she's being wed, and they're off to, this is their wedding night thing. But like they're slipping into the water, it's slipping in the mud, and but it's like I say, it's so tactile in that way throughout the film. And I think the inside scenes are confusing but claustrophobic, and they sort of this thing of, because one of the things I think that especially if you go to Europe and you go to a medieval castle, one of the things that sort of is forgotten about is, if I was to go to a medieval castle that exists in the UK somewhere now, or in France or Germany or wherever, right, it's empty. We are walking into a ruin. So you walk into a room and you go, oh, this is quite a big room or whatever. No, that room probably had 12 people in it doing whatever. Like, it was that place was crowded. It had loads of stuff in it. The bedrooms were like, because they didn't have quilts and covers, it would have been animal skins that made up the beds and all this other stuff. Like,
and live animals.
and
All
live
those
animals.
castles were filled with live animals.
Yeah.
Wandering
So-
through the
yeah.
castle.
So that
Eating
claustrophobia,
and-
exactly. But one of the things I find interesting is because it's so tactile. One of the things he does, he has a scarf. He has like lots and lots of white scarves, and he drops them several times throughout the film. But what's clear is, after all, they are perfumed. And he is sniffing them, and he keeps holding to his nose, and other people keep grabbing them and sniffing them out because that smells nice. It's oiled or it's perfumed. And once they get dirty, he drops them and leaves on. Like he does it several times, and people grab them, and that you see them in the background. That there's this thing of like just grabbing, not so much fighting, but someone will grab it, and that's it. They've got this thing from this god, this son of a god. But one of the massive things you were talking about the actors, how many actors? One of the things that quickly struck me, and I want to praise this film for, is one of the most impressive things. I'm always impressed with background actors. I'm always impressed with when you see films of war or whatever, and they'll show you hundreds of soldiers in a row or whatever, right? And you go, oh, it's a lot of people. They've had to organize a lot of people in that, and they'll give you like background acting. But this film is so its depictions are so layered. Like this film has got immediate. I'm not going to say foreground. It's like immediate in your face. Then the foreground, then the midground, and then the far off. And there is something happening all the time throughout all of it.
Yes.
Like this
That's
feels
a very good point.
This feels like a lived in space. Like if I could, I'm not going to watch this film again, but if you were to watch, scenes again, like you could sit and just watch the background.
Oh,
You could sit and just watch the background, and you go, my God, there is something going on in every scene in the background. There are people doing things. There are people going on about their lives. And what this made me think of, especially in the foreground, because this film is, and it took me, and I was so annoyed with myself that it took me a little while to realize this. Although we are following, this film's a documentary. And I did not get that. This film's a found footage film, if you want to call it that, in that sense. Because
I'm not really clear on that, but yeah, okay.
I think it is, and I'll say what, because I love all this thing. It feels real. Because people, whoever it is that lens, you are the lens, right? You are the cameraman, as the viewer, you are the cameraman going through all this utter filth and all these people. And there are a number of times when people stop and look you in the face.
Oh yeah.
Or
talk to the camera.
Or talk to the camera, like literally, and just off kilter lines. Or there's people flagging things in front of the camera and all this other stuff, like chicken legs or mud or a bit of rope. And there's a point where someone's like, one of the reasons like it made me realize about those scarves is someone grabs it and waves it in front of the camera, and then it moves off. And you see things parting for the camera, like cloth and ropes and things move out the way. But what it reminded me of, and this is the point I wanted to get to, and why I was so impressed with the technicality of how this has been put together. Because some of these scenes, if you said cut on one of these and someone blew their line or whatever, resetting one of these must have been a bloody nightmare.
Yeah, they're like 20-minute walk and talks with like 100 people in the background of everything.
Yeah, I am convinced that there must be like bloopers within the film where they've gone, carry on, go, just keep going. But one of the things I was fascinated with, it made me think of, when you see footage from World War One, like this is what it hit me with. Footage of World War One, and you see like the guys in the trench or whatever, or in a hospital, and you see all these people like wrapped in bleeding bandages and covered in filth in the trenches, but they'll all sort of go, hello, all right, what's that? It's a camera. And they'll all get in front and you'll see someone's face. And I was like, this is like watching early camera footage from the late Victorian, early sort of 20th century. It really had that, where I was like, that's what this kept feeling to me. Like, I don't know what this all is, but this feels real. Like, this feels like I am capturing something live, foreground, background, midground, immediate, like everything. And that's why I think I felt so sick, if I'm honest. Like, not just the viscerality of it all, but this thing of like, it's real. Like, this feels real in a bizarre way that I can't quite explain.
To me, this is all brilliant. I mean, you're putting it better than I can, and all of this is the highest praise imaginable. That it's managed to do this. I found that was one of my theories about the camera. As you say, it's clear people are looking at the camera.
Yeah.
After a while, it's very clear this isn't just like an actor's mistake or something like that. This is,
Intentional.
That
Yeah,
talk
yeah.
to the camera, show things to the camera throughout. But then there are other times where the camera's not there, or it seems like it's not there. Where you see the order coming through, and one of them sort of looks at the camera, but they're not reacting as if there's a person standing there that they're going to take some action against or not, right? So maybe a camera's been hidden. I don't know. But it never explains what's going on. And if there were a camera, like you're saying, people are reacting to being filmed. I love that theory. I mean, that's quite brilliant. It did run through my head, but I wonder, like, if it were a camera, like a box or something, people would see it, right? I mean, there'd be some sort of, it would be incongruous. There'd be some discussion about it or something. Is it like a body cam of a police officer where
I thought
this
that
is going to be taken back to Earth? But then again, this is ambiguous. I don't know what the answer is, but it's fascinating.
And that ambiguity both fascinated and frustrated, because you're right. There are several scenes, like the discussion with the woman who is possibly his partner, who's pregnant, and there's a couple of others, as you say, where it's like, oh, this is clearly not like a found footage, like a captured thing. But then sometimes that scene will literally have the main character turn around, almost like beckoning someone through, and the camera then follows him. So I'm like, oh, is it supposed to be? So there's an inconsistency that in itself becomes frustrating, because it's like, are you supposed to be? But what I find is that, like, it's almost like the truest form of a fly on the wall, but you are being acknowledged, like you are there. It may not be a camera, but I think that what the intent is of Aleski German is to make you feel like you are there.
Well, and that's certainly achieved, right?
Yeah,
we both said it.
I mean, could you imagine watching this? I watched this on a tablet, and it's quite close up, but can you imagine watching this on like a VR helmet?
Yeah. Well, or in the theaters.
Yeah.
I mean, I watched this on a big screen TV, and it certainly made an impression. Yeah, but I mean, I think this is sort of high praise. It does strike me that, I'm willing to go along with like the first half, the first hour to hour and 30 is sort of just, for me, I'm immersed in this culture. I'm immersed in, like, it's going to take you half an hour just to realize what's going on in this movie, right? That it, like, in the sense of just, go with it. Everything that you've just said of experiencing the Middle Ages, and there are differences. I mean, there are things where clearly you could not repurpose this footage as medieval footage on Earth, right? There are these subtle differences that are fascinating, and every time you sort of notice them, you're sort of the crests and the sort of like the crystal on his head, and sort of things like this. You're like, oh my Lord, this is, it made me think of Villeneuve's Dune, where we said, this feels lived in. This feels like every end table has been designed within an inch of its life, except that's very clean and antiseptic, and this is obviously the extreme opposite end. But it has that same sense of, I really believe this is a real place. Yes. I'm immersed utterly. And I think that first hour is mostly just immersing you. And I'm sure rewatching it, I would find tons of clues that I didn't the first time through. But
I think that's the thing. This it's one of those odd things. This film demands rewatching, but is almost impossible to rewatch, in my opinion. You say it's high praise, and you're right, for what it is as an art piece, and that's what this is. I almost refuse to call this a film, because there's a narrative missing. It is a film, but it's not a movie. Let me put it that way. Like, we're not looking at a plot. It's not building to a climax. It's missing those bits. This is an art piece about mood. This is gaining a visceral reaction as a viewer, which I think, like you say, some films wish they could do and don't ever really get there. But the other thing is, I'm watching this and I say, just that first, as you say, is the immersion. One of the things I find is the fact that they're determined to prove to you, say to you, it's an alien culture, and it is, like you say. There's different bits and pieces about when they kill people, they hang them up and they cover them in fish guts and fish scales because that's what attracts the birds to peck out their eyes, and you have all these, which is horrifying throughout it. And there's all these other different bits and pieces that are very alien. The it's not an issue. And this may even be incorrect, but it's sort of like the Middle Ages. Firstly, they're called the Middle Ages for a reason, but the Middle Ages exist because of events very specific events in Europe at that period. The Middle Ages exist because of the fall of the Roman Empire and the reversion of many countries back to specific things, because there was a vacuum of leadership, especially in Britain. And in parts of, in that sort of France, we reverted back to a part of what was left behind, but to a feudal system, and land was taken, lords were created. It was bloody chaos for a proportion of it. And the reason it's called the Dark Ages, not incorrectly really, is because no records were really kept in certain parts, because and all this other stuff. Like, it existed because
people were phenomenally ignorant.
Oh,
and
yes.
hostile to the concept of intelligence.
Because exactly. Oh, yeah, which is very much what this film is about. But
yes,
which is right. But it happened because of the fall of another empire, and that's always one of these things that bothers me about fantasy films. Other things when they're like, "Oh, it's a faux Middle Age area," and I'm like, "No, for God's sake, like, stop doing this faux Middle Ageness." But it feels like in this film, like, the one thing I feel it's missing, if I'm anything, is like, I don't know how you do it, but I almost want the context of the rest of the history of this planet. Of like, why have they got to this point? Like, almost like just some offhanded comment would be useful to be like, in the narration of like, there was no fall of the Roman Empire or anything like that, or it has not been in disarray or whatever. But like, this is just a natural progression, and that's what you're supposed to take. But I don't know, it just feels oddly convenient that it feels like the European Middle Ages.
Well, I mean, it's a case of parallel development, and and I want to talk about that in a second. I think this point about the Middle Ages is interesting. You're right, of course, but I've been reading a bunch of Roman stuff for comics I'm writing, and like, it never wasn't the Middle Ages in France.
Oh yeah.
Like, I mean, Marseille was a pretty strong port, but I mean, like, if you were in Gaul or Germania, I mean, it was like, if you were lucky to have a castle, there were a lot of Roman towns that were basically, all the structures were wood slapped together. It looked like the Old West trapper town. And yeah, I mean, there were clay structures and all of this, but I mean, like, when we think of the Middle Ages, like that level of technology, the issue isn't that is unique to the Middle Ages. That was always the way it always was.
I think maybe I'm not articulating, because what I mean is
the feudal kind of like
the feudal thing.
Yeah,
because you're right. But in this country at least, like, the Romans came in and they united in some cases a lot of the tribes, not in a positive way. They basically beat the crap out of people until they submitted. Like,
the Romans did. You're talking?
Yeah, the Romans came in and they sort of like, they had certain tribes and certain kingdoms that gave over very easily. And then you have sort of like Boadicea or Boudica, whichever way you pronounce it, fought back. They obviously reached the Scottish and were like, yeah, not having any of that. Thank you very much. We'll just build a wall. And so Britain was very much sort of like in that. We I think Britain, at least parts of it, were very Romanized. Others less so. But
Mhm.
there was always, where it was less so, there was still these sort of Saxonized, nomadic in some cases tribes. They sort of, and when the Romans left, this country particularly fell into sort of chaos, and we get the multiple kingdoms. Mercia and London. London wasn't the thing that people think of is like, well, London's always been your capital. No, London's always been there, but it wasn't unified. Like, this country was not unified really in the same way that people think of it today. Like, it was a multiple of kingdoms. And in fact, at one point, Mercia, which is where I lived, funnily enough, just down the road from us, was actually the capital of the country at one point. London was instituted by the Romans and other stuff. But when
Loved them.
Exactly, yeah. When we did fall back following the Roman Empire, like, it was a complete lack of leadership. The structure that had been put in place collapsed, and so we went back to this battling, this kingdom sort of fiefdom, this feudalism, because it was always about fighting, and that's where you get, like, the kings of England, or the kings trying to unite those tribes and stuff, and it goes into a whole load of stuff. But it took hundreds of years really to get to. But this country, but the point is, of like, there's a lot of history that came to that point of the technology, the castles, the Motte and Bailey castles were wooden, the stone castles and everything that's depicted didn't come till much later. They really came till the late Middle Ages. And I know that's what this is, because they talk about the Renaissance on the verge of, like, this film. And in this film, if it was to be in our history, is probably looking at like 12th century, 11th and 12th century. I don't know. There's a
Depends
period.
what country, right? Because the Renaissance is
very
centuries
much
apart, depending on which country you're in.
Yeah, we didn't get it. We didn't get it for quite some time in this country.
That's true. And Italy was like cruising along in the 1200s, and you're like 1600s.
Yeah, we took our time, much like we do with everything else.
Whereas we in America are pure of all of this. We never oppressed local tribes.
So it is fascinating, but
I think that you can get a medieval level of technology.
Yeah.
And I think that the other thing is that history doesn't go in a straight pattern, right? So if you think about like a roughly medieval level of technology, that makes sense. But also the idea of the Middle Ages is just the response to the last collapse.
Yes.
Right. So like the sort of like up and then down a little on up, and then it's any pattern, right? It's not straight up. But think about the like Bronze Age collapse, right? Which was much worse than the Roman collapse, that set humanity back 1,000 years, and is little understood. We talk about the Sea Peoples and eruptions and all of this, but basically society got knocked back, and it could have just progressed, and we would have been at like
much
the Roman
ahead.
Empire 500 years later. And instead, it takes 2,000 years. So, I mean, in other words, like the Roman Empire, some sort of there's always this sort of pattern. So, I know what you're saying. I would like to see more of the world. I'd like to see more of the history. But I mean, in this immersion style, we don't get it, right? We don't even get to see like the rocket ships that have taken them here from Earth, right? So.
Yeah, and but that's interesting in itself. I think but that's the thing about the history, and that sort of, it didn't bother me so much, but I felt like there was a, I think I just get annoyed by this in other fantasy things, that like, oh, it's easy to have a medieval depiction of this fantasy world. I'm like, yeah, come on, be different, do something different. But I know this film is specific for that. I like that you don't get to see the spaceships. I'm glad, because I don't want it to ruin the immersion into this environment. I kind of also like that the scientists have gone native.
Yeah.
And when you do meet them, because they meet in a group and they start talking and stuff, there's a sort of like a group that you kind of get to see, and they're talking about going back to what it is on Earth and stuff. But they have wholeheartedly accepted this world and where it's at, and the debauchery that's involved in it. And I kind of like that they have gone native. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, I like that too. I mean, but let's take a step back. And one thing that I kept thinking through the whole thing is, I'm a fan of like The Left Hand of Darkness. The Left Hand of Darkness is basically a Star Trek episode. It's a little different. This is a Star Trek episode. So imagine, right, that like Kirk and crew have gone down to a planet and they're there to monitor, right? It's like those episodes where like Riker secretly, changed to look like them, whatever. Obviously, there's no need for altering the appearance, but the people from the Federation, except it's a little different. It's some sort of communist Earth or whatever, but that's not important. Have been monitoring, and they're not supposed to interfere, right? Except the civilization they're monitoring is horrific. It is stuck in this Middle Ages. There's the Order, which is like, we saw this on the original show, right? With like the Nazi planet and Piece of the Action and all this stuff. I mean, these cases of parallel development, right? So this is like a Star Trek episode that begins 20 years into this dude's mission, where they've all gone native and they're all like trying not to affect the timeline, affect this planet's development, but also like that's really hard to do. It's we're connected now, and this is terrible, and we know how terrible it is. And eventually the main character is like, forget it, I'm going to break the rules. I think if you think of it like that, it's a really fascinating way to view it.
And that's the thing. This isn't like an anthropological experiment, isn't it? This is that thing of like, what do they say? The moment you view something, you change the way it works. And that's what they've done. But they've gone further. They are actually inserted in this. They formed friendships and they've formed connections and all this other stuff. And it's almost like he's being punished. Like I say, he's set up to be punished for all these things. And it's almost like this is this is almost like his goodbye. Like he's going around all these characters to meet all these people, but making sure, what I think's interesting about that is, like you say, he's trying not to intervene or interfere. Like, apart from being seen as a god, and I kind of like the title of it's a little on the nose, but the title of the film is a line that he repeats several times, and he says to the scientist at the end of it, like, if you're going to go back to Earth and you're going to tell them what happened here, just tell them it's hard to be a god. Like, that's his thing. Like, to stay and to be in that position, the Messiah, is actually really difficult, and to not interfere. But he is, because there's times when he goes, like, there's a baron that he meets, this big burly, like, beardy guy who he meets, who ends up in a cage later, but he's given him a weapon. He gives him a sword that they've dealt with, that it appears that he has had a hand in creating, and he uses then to cut this massive wooden shitty chair in half. So he's actually furnishing them with weapons in some way, but like on the sly. And again, like, I'm only inferring this, like, it's never said. It's just what it's what I'm taking from what I'm being shown. And that's what this film is throughout. Is like, you have to sort of go, I think that's what I'm seeing, and I'm taking from the information I'm given that that's what's happening. But yeah, he's sort of interfering, but like trying to do it on, quietly with different bits and pieces.
Yeah, and it is sort of like, I mean, and they clearly do have a kind of prime directive, that he's violating. And that's an interesting scene, because there are two spots where we have something like this that I noticed. But there's an earlier scene where a dagger or something is being scraped across cloth or something like this, and it
lights. Yeah.
Yes. And so in the same scene where he uses the sword to cut the chair in half, it sparks when it hits the chair. And I found myself wondering, like, is this the technology, that this is just advanced technology, or is this something in the air that, like, the chemical compounds work differently on this planet? I don't know, but it's interesting.
It is, and like I say, but it never confirms it, and I do like them. No. Like, that is true. It does give you this thing of what has happened. Like, there's clearly been an earlier interaction between these people. Like, you're not seeing the start or even the end of some of the sort of conversations and tales that are going on. Like, you are seeing, as you said, non sequiturs, or like a mid part of an interaction that's like, we've had this conversation before. Here's an update, and we'll finish it off another time. And you're like, hang on, sorry, what do you mean another time? Like, I want to know what's going on. And it happens over and over again. So there's characters that are introduced, because there's one guy later on that keeps threatening to kill him, and he ends up like, having a bit of a tussle with him, and all this other stuff. And you're like, okay, well, what's that all about? Like, I had no real clue what was going on at that point. I was like, okay, like, and there's this small boy that keeps following them around that turns out to be linked with this other scientist, and he knows about Earth. This boy knows about Earth, because he says later on about, well, when you get back to Earth, you're going to be imprisoned or court-martialed, even. And it's like, how this boy? Who's this kid then? Is he like a child of one of the scientists? Like, what does he know? Because he's a vile little rat bag. Like, he's literally going on stealing from the dead bodies in the battlefield and stuff. So I'm never 100% like, as you say, like, I don't know who is how, what is the order of things in this situation, like who is actually in the taking the lead, like what are people's roles in this. There's the chaos of it as well.
Well, and I will say, although I think this is brilliantly shot, obviously a masterpiece in terms of cinematography and set design and costuming and everything. I mean, it's just like a visionary accomplishment. That ambiguity, we talked about it in Alphaville. Like, look, we are English-speaking audience members. We want a little. We're also educated. We can tolerate ambiguity. Like, how hard is it to just have like a few lines of dialogue somewhere along the way that would establish these things, right? Where, since I met you, to the boy, right? Like, I mean, it can be artificial, but when they follow gangsters around with recording devices, they'll say, like, it's a shame he's gone, like, you got him good, like, they do establish this stuff. And I think that a little bit of that, it's amazing how much, a few sentences can do in terms of just establishing, what's his mission, what's really going on with X, Y, and Z.
It's interesting because yes, 100%. I agree with what you're saying, because that's the thing, is it definitely has this feel of there's a purpose to what's going on. Like, him traveling around this castle and doing these things has a purpose. Like, he is doing it for a reason. He knows things and he is imparting information, or he is interacting in a certain way to do certain things. But I'm watching it, and in my head, I'm saying, like, it feels like there's a purpose. I don't know what that purpose is. I don't know how one scene connects to another, because the scenes don't have a continuity. It's not like it's a difference between. This is one of those films that's definitely like, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, rather than this happened, and so they went on to do this thing, and that was then resulted in this person getting involved and this thing happening. Like, there's so little interconnectivity between this that I'm sure that there are scenes that, because even the editing on this is very good, that you could take this whole film, or at least the first 2 hours of it, let's say, right? Leave the last 57 minutes. Those first hours, you could rejumble an awful lot of those scenes, and it would be exactly the same. And I think that's part of the problem. Is I'm going, well, it means nothing then. It really is a difficult situation.
Well, you say that's a problem, but I think that if the point of those scenes is more sort of ambiance, and then it's not necessarily a problem. And I do have the sense, like, there are things like, I wish there were a line about, who the cameraman is or what's going on with that, because you say it seems inconsistent. But I do have the sense that at least most of these questions are answered in the film, or at least that the filmmaker knew the answers to it, even if we don't. So with that in mind, I think that the order of those scenes matters, right? I mean, he's doing something going around the castle. I mean, there's stuff that we don't understand that there's an answer to. I think that answer should be in the movie. I'm not sure that it is, but
Yeah, I think that's the case. You're probably right that there is an order, and I think, you know, if I was if I was to watch this back in quick succession, you'd probably identify some of that.
Mhm.
As to why these things are happening. Because there are scenes, I think, you know, at its running time, and I will go on, it's 2 hours and 57 minutes, it's a 3 hour film. There are scenes that you do sort of go, this could probably have been cut. But when you get to the end, I think, as you say, like, you know, okay, it's been made like this for a purpose. I mean, there's a really interesting scene. You say about him trying to save these people. There's a scene where he saves a slave. There's
Yeah,
a
this
slave,
is fascinating.
and he cuts the slave's chain.
Chain.
At one point, he's going to do it like right next to his face, and then he's like, "Oh no, I'll do it over here," and he sort of cuts it a bit further away, and you get that full sparking in the whole thing again. The chain breaks,
Mhm.
and the slave's like, "I'm free, I'm free." He's got still got this stock around his neck, and he runs off, and then he dies.
Yeah, it's very strange. There's and in fact, was it the boy? Somebody else in that scene says, "Why are you freeing him?
Yeah.
I love this. They say he's been in chains since he was 3,
Mm.
right? Like, so he doesn't know anything else. I mean, this is like, and he's just like, he'll die. And you think it's sort of like, oh, it's, like you can't release a dog into the wild,
Yeah,
who's used
they
to
don't have the
dog
survival. They don't have the survival instincts and
Right.
stuff.
You can't take a zoo animal, right?
Yeah.
Exactly as you say. But then he's sort of this freedman who's still in the stocks. I don't know why you wouldn't cut off the stocks, except there are a lot of slaves, and that seems to be the indicator of the slave. But I don't know why that's not removed. But then he runs sort of along a building, rethinks what he's doing, and starts running back, and then falls down dead.
Mm.
And he apparently really is dead. And so I found myself wondering, like, is this like an animal who, sometimes animals die in the headlights or of a
Mm.
heart attack because they just can't deal with it. Has this the humans of this planet, are they prone to dying of that kind of like heart attack when they're in unforeseen circumstances?
I don't know. I have no answer, to be honest. It's a bizarre scene, but because the slaves, and there are lots of slaves, there are people in stocks in this, and it's clear, like, you know, are treated, and this is what's fascinating, they are treated horrendously, like, you know, in certain scenes. And it's the boy that's doing it. This kid that we learn that is actually got knowledge of Earth and stuff. And he keeps like playing like weird tricks on people, on the slaves, on this other thing, these enslaved people. And several times, when they first come to the castle, so it follows the opening, and they've gone through all the outside, and they first come to the entrance of the castle. There's a scene where like he's just shouting at the slave for doing it wrong, and it's, you know, really sort of laying into him, and you are like, oh, these are, you know, not serfs, these are slaves, and you see them throughout the film.
Mhm.
And they are treated. There's scenes later on where you see them being beaten because they've got in the background. Again, this is all background stuff as well. Like, not all of it's in the foreground. You just see like there's one being whipped later on, and you're
Mhm.
thinking like that's just in the background. So like there's just there. Like if you don't notice it, you don't notice it, but it's there. And there's other things going on. And I just sort of they're like a ubiquitous part of this culture, this slavery. But they're all, and this is the interesting thing, and that I was finding, they're all white. And I don't want to bring race into it, but there's no question, or there's no comment to say that these are a minority or a subservient race,
Mm.
or a, you know, a minority in any way. Like they look like everybody else in that sort of thing. They're just in stocks, so you don't know if they're a conquered people or if they're they're just there. And it was,
Socioeconomic, or
yeah, there's nothing to distinguish why they are in stocks, or why he has been since he was 3. That slavery structure is never explained either, and I think that I was fascinated by that as well, because they keep popping up, and in some scenarios they seem to have more, not influence, but they seem to be so in some scenes when they're inside in particular, they're like a part of
Mm.
the scene. Like they're engaged with, they are spoken to, they are.
And once in a while, they say something that you think that would be a little cheeky for a slave, right? It's
Yes.
like, yeah,
And so
right.
there's like, there's this thing of like some slaves have got a better connection with their master, stuff like, yeah, it's all very, very complex, but like you don't get any information about it at all.
Well, I find the issue of slavery fascinating because, obviously as an American, we have our own history,
Mm.
which was shot through with racism.
Mm.
And, is really quite unforgivable. Having said that, slavery has been the norm throughout human civilization. The concept that slavery shouldn't exist is a very strange one in history. And slaves never were defined by race.
Mm.
Sometimes they were the neighboring tribe,
Mm.
but and it was harder to you don't enslave a Roman citizen. But I mean, the Romans had slaves, and the majority of them looked like Romans, right? I mean,
Yeah.
so
But as you said though, there'd be a socioeconomic factor into that, or they
right.
they would be European, so they might be sort of like a conquered people, so they've been ferried in from maybe Germany or France, or maybe France, but like parts of central, Austria or wherever it was,
Or
Central
North
Europe
Africa,
or North
yeah.
Africa, they would be ferried in to be slaves there. But yeah, I don't know. It's the fact of like they're just a part of the culture and it's never explained is interesting.
Yeah, see, I like that
Mm.
because there is that part of me that just goes, "Oh yeah, yeah, that would be normal, right? Like that's
Mm.
probably going to be normal for a civilization that's
At this point in
at this
history.
point,
Yeah, yeah.
right? Even though it wasn't a normal part of our Middle Ages in
Mm.
Europe. Um, yeah, well, the other thing I wanted to touch on was this depiction of the Middle Ages and of religion, especially.
Mm.
And I would say like historically, beyond slavery was the norm. Totalitarian states were the norm, and theocracies were the norm,
Oh
right?
yeah. Yeah,
So,
yeah.
I mean, 99.9% of all humans who have ever lived, well, at least post agriculture, right? So, let's talk about post agrarian society. Um, you know, lived under a theocratic dictatorship,
Mhm.
and where the king was also the head of the church, and God was on his side, and your job
I,
was to
I like the way you're saying "was," as if I still don't live in a country where the monarch is still the head of the church and appointed by God and all that kind of crap. So, yeah.
yeah, and that's disgusting to me. But then like look, just yesterday I was listening to a report on poverty in this country and how much money from the welfare budget, from the federal welfare budget, states then take and allocate to Christian summer camps and stuff like this, and
Mm.
marriage, proposals and stuff like this, on the idea that that's really the good way to fight poverty is to get more souls for Christ, right? Because the prosperity gospel nonsense. But and also marriage is slightly correlated to being out of poverty, but that doesn't mean you just get
Yeah.
more people to marry each other and that'll be the solution without need to feed them. So we're funneling my tax dollars to Christian theocratic nonsense, and this is going on all the time here and always has. So we talk a good game, but we're really full of shit as anyone else, and probably more full of shit than you guys are, despite your head of state. But it's debatable. But we and I do see there's a rise of this movie is very prescient,
Mm.
and besides that we've watched the rise of fascism in our lifetimes in the last 15 20 years, and the rise of real theocratic movements, especially in my country but
Mhm.
also in yours, of this is a Christian country. Are you out of your mind? Let me show you what a Christian country looks like.
Yeah.
It looks like hard to be a god. And that's not a knock on Christianity. Anytime that religion, look, I mean, let's be clear. I love the Dalai Lama. Okay, the Dalai Lama is a cool guy in interviews. The Dalai Lama presided over a theocratic dictatorship where the vast majority of people were poor. This is not unique to Christianity. I'm not knocking Christianity here, but I do think there's something to this.
Oh no, I agree. And I was fascinated, especially in the medieval. To take that medieval tract again, as you said. So, Christianity was introduced to this country through the Roman Empire. And it was set up and took off like it really did. I mean, it became following the collapse and that, like I say, that chaos after. It became a fundamental part of it. Like those in charge were ordained by God. Like you had to have a bishop or you're a priest on your side, wherever it was. And obviously that goes even further, that we then had a monarch later on who disagreed with the Pope and was like, well, screw it then. I'll make my own denomination of Christianity and I'll do whatever the hell I want. And being the head of the church could do so in this country. But you're right. But I think, there is this, but there's a weirdness of this because to this, and this is obviously goes back to the history. Yes, we were a Christian country during the medieval period, like this country, but there was no churches. There wasn't church like that. This wasn't, there's this weirdness. There's this odd view that like even in, they were pulling up mud or crops or whatever, and then would all go to church on Sunday. Like that wasn't the case. It was still very much a village by village or whatever, and if you did pray, it would probably be within your own home, and there would still be all these other things. It was still very sort of thing, but you feared God. However, there was still the hangover of, and I'm not going to say pagan or those things, but there's a folkloric hangover that lived through all of this, that got interwoven with Christianity. I mean, medieval Christianity is so replete with witchcraft, and not evil witchcraft, like folkloric medicines and beliefs and all this other stuff, that like it was all part and parcel. Like you could believe in God and this other thing, but you could still believe in fairies and gnomes and goblins, all these other creatures, as well as witches and curses and burying a potato on the third moon and whatever the hell you were doing. All part and parcel of it. And so there's a real sort of, although there was a theocracy, like as well, the theocratic top, whoever was at the top, ordained by God. I often wonder, and I think this might be the case, you could go, right, so-and-so's at the top, King Canute's at the very top of the tree, but let's go and visit this village in, what would have been rural Leicestershire at the time. Do they know who's at the top of the tree? Do they care, other than who is their lord? Because that's who they owe their fealty to or whatever. I'm not sure that would have been. It was more about that belief system was more about fear within the home and within the impersonal than being sort of like oppressed from above when they had to pay taxes and stuff. But I think that comes a bit later. I think that the true theocracy comes towards the end of the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance sort of time in different times.
Yeah, I mean, I know what you're saying, and it's worth pointing out that like as Christianity first spread, it spread in rural areas, right? I mean, and it's also clear you were talking about Christianity once it was dominant, still embracing pagan traditions.
Yeah.
But the whole concept of Christianity was always already a mixture of Jesus plus the Greco-Roman world, because Jesus said, "I'm not here for people who aren't circumcised." Okay, Jesus explicitly said, "I don't care about you if you're not circumcised. The Gentiles, I have no message for them whatsoever." Said that, right? Indisputably, and then suddenly he's died. I have a vision. His life is for everyone, and suddenly he was resurrected in a story very much like other stories, and suddenly there was an attempt to kill him as a baby, very much like other stories, and there's this massive shift from anything recognizably Jewish into this weird amalgam religion. But then and that at first succeeds most in rural areas. It's not going to go over well in Athens, but then over time, as you say, it becomes like a Christian empire. Christian theocracy in different areas. But as you say, so we have the term heathen
Yeah.
because, you were people of the heath who didn't believe because Christianity never penetrated the countryside and
Yeah.
still hasn't to this day. And that's why we have Halloween and we have, all these other adaptations. And Easter looks the way it is, like, yeah, there's a lot that, and then over here, Christians get mad at that and say, but then it's like, well, it's always been intermixed and strange. But I mean, as far as the totalitarian theocracy thing goes, like, yes, I mean, it's important to point out that, like, the concept of totalitarianism, when we think of totalitarianism, we think of the 20th century version in
Yes.
which it was possible to really control everything, right? And today, we can monitor your thoughts virtually, certainly your computer searches. But certainly by the middle of the 20th century, the Nazis and, the fascists were able to really control all aspects of life in a way that, like, Babylonian rulers who are absolutely, or Egyptian, absolute theocrats, absolutely totalitarian, can walk down the street and kill anyone they want, and did. And yet, you go 10 miles outside of Cairo and nobody knows what's going on out there, right? There's no state control 5 miles outside of the capital city. I mean, and that wasn't even true until, the 1800s, that there was any kind of state control of the countryside. Just not something, outside of a tax collector comes around once in a while. You just had no contact with Paris. You didn't speak the same language.
Yeah. And the same because, London was, I'm assuming there'd be some people, pre-industrial revolution that would be like, I've sort of heard of this place. I don't know, no idea what it is. But like I said, the fealty would have been to the Lord of the Manor. I mean, one of the things that's, not even an architecture, it still exists within our, even here. So I live next to a small, I don't know, it's not a town, it's a village, but it's a large village, say, it's grown, called Measham. It's literally the next village over that way. And next to, as you just leave it slightly, there's a place called Measham Manor Farm. We were talking about today, called Measham Manor Farm. And there's like a gatehouse. It's literally called the gatehouse next to what would have been the gate to the two big stone posts that would have been a gate. And there's a farmhouse at the top. And the farmhouse is very large. It's the former manor house. It's now a farm, right? But that was the house. That was the manor house that looked over this area, this farmland. And before Measham was all these other things. There was a river that eventually became a canal, and all these things were used. But you knew the manor house. You were either a yeoman, in which case you owned your land, but you still had fealty to this manor house and the lord of the manor, or you rented your land of this person. And that was what you cared about. Right, can I pay my rent? Am I going to be able to feed my family? Like, there was no care really beyond that, of like, oh, we've got a king and queen or whatever, until much later. And I think this comes with, and I've dropped it a few times, this idea of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you're still in that bottom tier, those bottom couple of tiers, where you're trying to, ensure security and food and safety and stuff for your family and yourself, don't really give a monkeys about what's going on up here. Like, you just can't, you haven't got the capacity to do that. And that comes much later on, I think, as you say, as sort of like agriculture really becomes, grows, and the things, cities start to grow, and we start to see sort of the introduction of like the late Middle Ages and into sort of like the Tudors and the Stuarts and Henry VIII and, those sorts of monarchs, that people really did start to pay attention a bit more. But yeah, and the only other thing that's interesting in this, and I think it must be the same in others, is you may have had the manor, you may have also had an abbey, and that would have held some sway over your area as well, because people would have done pilgrimages to those places, or they'd have had some sway over, like, you've got to pay for the abbey because it's in your area, and all this other stuff. So it would have been there, but it'd always, like you say, it wouldn't have been. I don't know. It's an interesting. I'm always fascinated how that would have worked in those kind of ways.
I'm always amazed by how just kind of like rough and tumble everything always has been and always will be. and how much like the rules matter much less than the way people really implement them.
Mhm.
There's tons of stuff today that's, illegal, but nobody's ever, prosecuted for it. It's like it's illegal to jaywalk, but unless you do it, but everybody does it 20 times a day, and unless you
Yeah.
do it in front of a cop and the cop wants to make a point of it, nobody cares. Um, so there's a lot of stuff, and then you get into like selective enforcement and everything else. Um, you know, Teaching history, it's like the number one thing when you talk about European history that you've got to struggle with is students thinking the Pope ran everything.
Mm.
That people did what everyone was Catholic, and the people did what the Catholic Church said. Like, yes, in theory, every monarch said, "I love the Pope." The Pope
Yeah.
is awesome and in his wisdom. But then, what's the Pope going to do if you just decide not to, to drag your feet on this and to say you're honoring it? And you see the same thing in Japan, where you know yes, the emperor has said something, but there's some prefecture that's just like, no, we're not going to do that. And we think that we're honoring the emperor's true intentions
Yes.
by doing that, and so everybody debates that. And in reality, it's just all a mess, and nobody has the sort of control that they do theoretically.
Well, it's day by day, isn't it? And that's what I think. I think, when you go to, it's day by day. Like these people in the villages or those really rural parts of of medieval Europe, they weren't planning years ahead. They weren't planning months ahead. Often they were going, right, we've got to get through this season, so I've got to get this
Mhm.
crop done, so I need to be able to do this and this. That was it. Like that's the only thing. Or right, I need my cattle to do this or my sheep to do this or whatever. Like that was it was survival. It wasn't. And this is one of these things I find funny, that these scientists have obviously gone to this place, they've become natives or whatever. But you sometimes see like there's a film called Time Slides or something like that. It was a Dean Koontz. I think it was a Dean Koontz book as well, where you get these scientists end up going back to medieval England as well. And I'm like, if any modern person goes back to any form of in any part of the medieval period, you will not last. You're either going to be starve and die of exposure, because also they don't talk like us. Their language, their version of English is
Mhm.
so vastly different.
Of course.
You wouldn't be able to make any
Yeah.
make yourself understood. Or they would think you're talking gibberish, be scared of you and kill you. So
Mhm.
it's a violent, dangerous place, I think. But one of the things that I think that was watching this, I wanted to touch on, just as we get close to the end, that jumped into my head, and I was like, this is clearly unintentional. But you said the majority of mud and all this other stuff, and you've talked about this part of structure. I couldn't help but think of Monty Python and the Holy Grail when I was watching this film at times. And two scenes that came up in my head. The one, as we just talked about, as control, is when Arthur comes across those people that are like mud harvesting, and he says, "I am your king. I am King Arthur." And he says, "Who? I don't remember voting for you." Like, and there's this whole thing of like, we're an autocratic group of, and they go through this whole thing of what they are. And I was like, for some reason, that jumped into my head. But the other one, with everything that was going on and how crazy this thing was, the scene where they come to Camelot and they go, "Let's go to Camelot," and they have this whole dances. Let's not go there. It's a silly place. For some reason, that jumped in my head a little bit when I was watching this in some of the internal scenes. I was like, let's not go there. This is a silly place. And I couldn't shake it. I couldn't shake some of it because of the bizarreness of this. There was like this swings from vulgarity and shock to true shock in some cases, of like, not goriness, like the bit with the intestines falling out. I'm kind of fine with that. I've seen enough horror films to be like, yeah, fine. But the scenes of all the bodies hanging is shocking. The battle scene where the kids sort of like stealing from the bodies and messing with the corpses was shocking. But then it like verges to like such almost like ridiculousness in other scenes that's like jarring, because it's almost like it's almost comedic in its presentation, but not comedic, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. No, I mean, I also think of that head floating in water. You
Yes.
know, that they fish out. That seems so like Kurosawa, that shot to me. It's really beautiful, but
Mm.
it's just so understated. You know, but you know that's not a word that we would often use about this movie. Um, but you know, so you're talking about the extreme, and it does. I know what you're saying. I don't seem to have that effect.
Mm.
In my brain. Um, I know it. I know that it's something that exists, but to me, I always think of it as like the Titus Andronicus effect, right?
Hmm.
Where it's like
Hmm.
it's so over the top that yes, it's violence, yes, it's terrible, but that at a certain point, other people start to laugh, you know, and it almost becomes farcical.
Mm.
Um, and I know that's a thing that happens, but I don't seem to get that. I'm just like, oh, this is just unrelenting horror. And I do find myself wondering, like, is this realistic? You know, like a society that's at this level of daily slaughter. Obviously, it's been ratcheted up by the order, but you
Yeah.
know, this is not a typical week in um, this town.
No, because there's the threat of the order throughout the whole film, and that sort of again is quite high is highlighted. So this is a particular time that it feels like everything's gone is in a heightened state because of this threat. Like it feels like this is may not be um
Mhm.
typical. Like there'd be a bit more, little bit less going on. Excuse me, on a typical day. Because if it was this heightened the entire time, like, it'd drive you insane. You'd drive. This
Yeah,
is this is shell shock kind of territory, like World War One shell shock kind of territory. If you were this heightened the entire time, I don't know.
yeah. Like on the one hand, this is around this massacre, right?
Mm.
Which like, and the original novel is part of like a whole set of novels,
Oh, really?
the Noon universe or whatever. Um, that evolved into this sort of like shared universe of sort of communist like federation that sends people out to these planets. Um,
Like a
but
communist version of Dune.
well, like a communist version of the Federation of
Oh,
planets in
Star Trek.
Star
Oh,
Trek,
really? Oh,
right?
wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
where yeah, of course the communists are going to win, and they have no need for money and no need for
Mm.
basically all material resources are solved, but they send people out, and so yeah, I mean, I think so. So in that sense, this is about this massacre, right,
Mm.
that happened and the events surrounding it. So this is a heightened moment in history. But on the other hand, there is a comfort with death and even one's own death because it's a daily occurrence. You're around it. We've talked about how divorced we are
Mm.
from the realities of death. That was not true in the Middle Ages. You
No.
know?
No.
I mean, and even just animal death. I mean, the amount of just corpses and just dead animals and you know fetid filth and everything was just constant. So this does that very well.
It does. All right. So I think we're going to start coming to the end on this one. And so um it's an, I'm going to give my final thoughts because it's interesting because we have praised this film. We do this thing of we'll take a film we really like and then pick it to
Mm,
pieces and we get to the end of the
hmm
podcast and we're like, no, we generally like this film. Um One thing I've got to say is this: I thought about this, and I've sort of rolled around in my brain, and I've thought about a lot of the films that we've watched, um, in particular, sort of like non-English speaking, so a lot of the foreign language films and stuff outside of my usual purview, and how we take in those different cultures. And we go, oh yeah, we either like it or we can see what there is, or there's something we can, that's unusual or whatever. Um, but they're always films. They're always a movie in the sense of there's a narrative, and it could be extreme, and it can be whatever. But there's a narrative, and whilst you and I have sort of peddled out a plot or a narrative to this film, it's not. It takes work to find it. Like it's not explicitly there. You have to sort of I think I now know more about this film having talked it through with you in my head, in my own head. I've gone, oh yeah, of course that's what's happening, and I feel than when I watched it. It's a difficult watch. It's not fun. In cases I found this gruelingly boring in some scenes, but other scenes fascinating and almost like I couldn't stop watching them. To me, this is I'm not an art house movie watcher. I find them tedious, pretentious, and that sort of thing. This is possibly the first film that I will say is not a movie. This is a 3-hour piece of art. This is something that is visually, technically, and experimentally impressive and a sight to see. I think it's layered, but visually, I think that is fascinating how they've layered it and stuff. It got a visceral reaction out of me. I really struggled with it physically, and I think so, which is what art is supposed to do. This film affected me like a piece of art. It's not something I want to own on Blu-ray. It's not something where I'm like, that's going to be in heavy rotation with Gremlins. This is not a film I'm going to sit down and watch again. It's you'd have to be mentally prepared to watch this film. I see this in the same way that if I was to sit and if I was to sit in a cinema to watch this, it's to experience it. This is an experience that you go, wow, that's really, I can't believe that's been done. But it's not a narrative film. But
I think that's going too far. I mean, I will agree with you that a description of this film of a 3-hour depiction, a 3-hour movie in which things happen, right? There's an arc to this character, right? I mean, he resists getting involved, and then he gets involved, and he winds up. He hasn't killed anyone, he cuts off he's headed, and he winds up going all around and killing people, and then totally goes native and refuses to go back to Earth. I mean, there's a character arc there. There is a narrative. It might not be the meatiest narrative, it might not be the clearest narrative, but there's a narrative. There's a story here. I also think of, like one of my favorite films of all time is the documentary Koyaanisqatsi, which is a documentary, but ostensibly has no narrative, right? Now, everything has a narrative in some sense because you you juxtapose them in sequence, and our brains see a pattern, right? Yeah. And say, oh, you're going from, purple to red, or, from this to that, whatever. So, I mean, to me, what you're saying, so first of all, I would say that the description of this as a 3-hour long, which we've both owned up to, that's largely incoherent from your first viewing, certainly. Lots of sentences, lots of motivations are opaque. You're immersed in this other culture. It's as much about the feeling of being immersed in that culture as it is narrative. I don't think that means it's not a movie or a film. To me, so, and I don't separate art from movie. So to me, every movie is a piece of art. It might be just doing different things, right? It might be pop art. It might, so, I mean, I know people who are like, well, I'm not a writer. Well, you put words on a page, you're a writer, right? It doesn't have to be War and Peace for you to be a writer, right? So to me, I don't hold art up as this special notion. But yes, there's a version of this that sounds like the most stereotypical art house European movie, imaginable. But this is exactly the kind of movie that I would own on Blu-ray. And I would never own Gremlins. Now, on any given night, if Gremlins or this is on TV, I don't have the emotional energy at the time to get through How to Be a God, right? And I'm probably tired. I've been working all day. I want to chill out and watch Gremlins, right? Oh, I'm glad that's on TV, okay? Or I'm doom scrolling, through Netflix, and okay, Gremlins, yeah, let's do that. Hard to Be a God is on Canopy or whatever, and I'm like, yeah, not tonight. But I think about, this is the kind of movie that I want to watch again. I will watch this again.
Mm.
And also, I think that when we talk about how many movies are 3 hours long now
Oh
that have
yeah,
nothing to say,
yeah.
and that maybe they're punchy and they're entertaining, but I don't feel nourished afterwards,
Mm.
right? And so, yes, 9 times out of 10, I'm probably going to reach for the junk food, and I don't consider Gremlins junk food, but, I'm going to reach for, the new whatever movie, right? Action movie, fine. But then, I do feel more nourished after this. And I think, yes, if 3 hours is it's a lot to ask of somebody, especially given the fact that you have to think while watching this movie, right? But I've watched plenty of horrible, appalling movies that
Ah.
I didn't have to think about and left the theater or the experience going, I never want to think about that movie again. Like at best, that was mildly entertaining. I'm embarrassed for my country that movie exists. I'm kind of embarrassed that this is what people in Indonesia think about my country. um, and so to me, I'd probably be a better person if I watched Hard to Be a God instead of that other movie.
Maybe that's the point. Yeah, I think we're coming at it very similarly. But I think the point, I think you're right. Maybe I'm not articulated and not able to sort of explain it in the right way because I'm differentiating the two. I didn't say, I know what you're saying about films being art. This is more, there's the entertainment piece. Like the point of many of the films, good, bad, and I agree that films are massively overlong these days and don't need to be, for no real purpose. But are aimed to be entertainment. So there's the punchy, or there's the sort of like the sentimental piece, or there's whatever, and it's all there driven by a certain thing. This film, what's the difference I'm trying to make? Let's say if it was percentage wise, right? Let's say there's a scale where I'm watching. I don't know. Let's use a film that's quite plot driven. Like there's a film that's quite tightly plotted. Okay, there could be an art house film, Usual Suspects, or something. They've tried to sort of make it a complex plot, or a mystery
Tinker Tailor.
thriller. Tinker Tailor, a great example, right? But it's tightly plotted. It's got all these sort of things and these interwoven characters. The dialogue is sharp and all this other stuff. Like you're invested in that because it's a tightly woven plot that you have to think about it, right? Then you've got obviously the pop kind of stuff. You've got those films. You've got that film. Tinker Tailor's a good example actually, where I'm giving it all my energy. I'm weaving out the plot. But I feel I'm for me, this is the thing. I'm taking that as a piece of art. It's well acted, the performances are good, whatever. And I come away feeling nourished because I've had to work my way through a plot. And I follow those characters and the events that, well, this happened because of this conversation, this suspect or this happened like as a result of that thing happening. And so I'm driven by that. And I enjoy that, and that's going to take me somewhere. This film to me is more about, Tinker Tailor evokes something from me because it's engaging me in that way. This evokes something different. This evokes something in the same way as it's a mood piece. It's the only way I can think of. There must be a better word for it, but it's a mood piece. Like this is an immersive thing that is challenging you viscerally. This is, more so than any horror film, watching sort of any of those video nasties or banned films or sort of like, cannibal holocaust or whatever it's going to be. This film is basically showing you like a horrible, horrible place and then going like, you're here for the duration.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
it's like it's an endurance test, but in the same way that it's going like, look at this pile of shit. as in a literal pile of shit in the film. And here's this mud, and here's these chickens and dogs that are covered in filth, and it's wet and it's muddy, and these people are ignorant and suffering and all this other stuff. Like, here it is. But on the same time, it's going, look at how well this has been made. Like, when I'm going, like, I'm literally watching this going, like, this is fascinating that I'm watching these two guys sat on this hill. There's clearly something going on there. And I'm looking in the background at all these other things that are going on, and the way this is layered, and all these other different bits. As you said, the set dressing and the way it's organized to be either expansive or claustrophobic, and all these other things. And so I'm looking at it and going, there is no tight plotting going on here. You and I have hammered out a narrative, and you're right, there is a character arc, but it's not. This isn't a detailed, emotional payoff at the end. There's no sort of rousing moment or big battle, or there's nothing of like him screaming as he runs out of the castle with his broadsword wielding, like, he doesn't scream freedom as he sort of jumps out onto the battlefield or anything like that. I'm not saying
God.
Yeah, I know, I get
yeah.
that. My point is that sort of like, this is a mood piece. This is there just to go, this is it, and you take from it whatever the hell you want, and deal with it however you want. And almost, I feel like Terry Gilliam sort of does that a little bit at times, where you'll get like Gilliam's doing a plot, but then there's going to be a whole piece where he's going like, oh, but also like there's this, and you're going to have to deal with it however you want to deal with it. And so, yeah, but so that's what I'm saying. Like, it felt like it's an experience I've not really had in what I would say is a film experience. Like, I would say this is more, I've seen this watching documentaries of different battlefields, especially like some of the World War One and World War Two stuff, but especially the trenches of World War One. Just of that visceral filth of having to survive in that environment. But also, like, I've seen paintings and other things that have evoked a similar reaction to me, where you just like, in the same way, I'm going like, I'm really impressed and by the artistic talent and skill that's gone into creating this, but I'm struggling to look at the image that's being presented to me, and I kind of appreciate that, and I don't appreciate it. Did you know what I mean? Does that make sense? What I'm saying?
Do. Yeah, I mean, the way I would put that is like, if there are art museums that have video installations, many of whom I've been very affected by. I would not feel this out of place playing in a video installation in a museum.
Yes.
On the one hand, that is a tremendous kudos for a science fiction movie, right? Like, how astonishing. Well, let's not forget, 2001 has bits like that, right? I mean, and is not a normal narrative. You can summarize it in a sentence, but and goes on digressions and whatever else. But it has more narrative than this, right? For sure. But I mean, this would be comfortable being played in a gallery, in a museum, which is on the one hand high praise, and on another, like, it's not what most people come to a movie for.
Exactly. Right? Yes.
To be honest. Yeah. So, I do think that I think it's masterful. I don't know how to rate it, because
I don't. Yeah.
It's like, so many things are off the charts good, and then other things are like off the charts bad, but then I don't know that the movie cares about those things. Yeah. Right? So
or how you feel, or how you feel about them. Like, it doesn't care. Yeah.
Well, and I think that's kind of great.
Yeah, I think this is when we get to the end of the series, when we get to the end of this season, and we come back to sort of like rating the second half. This is going to be a tough one for me. Like, I don't like it if that's it, as a film that we're going to watch Blade Runner 2049 next, which is obviously
right.
I think it's I'll hide all my fears towards that, but it's a very different kind of film, and I'm like, and that's long. And again, I'm going to be like, yeah, that's film I can go, oh, it's technically good. I like the narrative. I like the actors. You have those typical categories to be able to go, I can tick that one, cross that one, whatever. I can't do that with this.
Yeah. and again, if I were making this, I would keep all of that stuff, but I would
Mm,
maybe cut 15 minutes. I would open with like the people on Earth, uh, reviewing the found footage, and mentioning like okay, so he's this, this is the trial in absentia for so and so,
mm,
and then you'd go into it and you'd be like, okay, well, this is the footage we have, right? It's going to have weird cuts, it's going to
mm.
have stuff that's unexplained, you know and it's amazing how much a little bit would give me more of what I'm looking for in terms of those narrative anchors for that
Yes, I know what you mean.
lack of ambiguity.
One thing,
um
yeah, and I think that's it because we've really got to sort of start looking wrapping
yeah.
up. One other thing I will say is you and I, we don't really cover short stories or novels or anything like that. We've never done that. Maybe something we'll eventually get to. We might do some as an extra for the Patreon. But one thing this is highlighted to me because we've obviously talked about we've covered Solaris, which is based, Stanislav Lem obviously wrote that book. I can't pronounce the guys the name who wrote the two guys that wrote Roadside Picnic, which is obviously another Russian novel. This is based in a whole. This is a single story within a wider shared universe, you say, of Russian literature. But all this is like Soviet era literature, which I have to say, like my knowledge of is zero at this point. Like I've watched several of the films, I really want to watch Stalker, and I really want to cover that at some point. But I know nothing about these books, and it's made me think now about of this similar era, these 60s and 70s kind of it. We're thinking of I'm trying to look at the Foundation series or some Philip K.
Mm.
Dick books or this Western idea of and things that were created, Star Trek, the original series, these notions of sort of science fiction and stuff versus the communist, behind the Iron Curtain kind of thing. There was still stuff being created, and I think there's something there to explore more in some of these areas, which I'd be kind of interested to look at some point in the future. Anyway, that's my
Yeah.
final thought. Any final thoughts for
Well,
this?
I agree with that. I think that all of our various countries' history of film and history of literature should be put in dialogue with each other, and that
Mm,
it's when you do that you get really great stuff. Just as a final thought, I would I agree with you. I would really like to recut this film, and we'll call it America 2100 if Donald Trump wins. Not far off.
mm. Letter from a Floridian.
Yeah, I like the Judge Dredd reference there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean this is frightening. It is both a visceral film, but also I do think that it has a message that is compelling for me.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm interested to see, let's say to all ladies and gentlemen, as always, thank you very much for listening. And everything else we say, come and check it out. This is one of those films that we do. We've covered a lot of pop culture stuff. We've covered all kinds of different bits and pieces from different languages. This is one of the ones where I'll be fascinated. I'm honestly fascinated if anybody has either watched this for this review or if any other point that you've come across it. Because as Julian said, he said in the last episode before we got into it, this has appeared on a number of lists of sort of like top science fiction films of all time, most of, all this other stuff. And it is a fascinating piece of study, and I'll be interested to find out what other people think of this. What do you think of Hard to Be a God? And have you read the novel? Have you read the books? I'll be really interested to know, is this a real cul-de-sac for some people of sort of like their knowledge and stuff? Is it, we sort of poking it into the shadows? But anyway, for now, please let us know if you enjoy what we're doing. Please leave a review. Let us know what you think of both us and our reviews. And also, please check out our Patreon because we're doing more and more of that. If you really like what we do on Stories Out of Time and Space, then there is more of Julian and I doing stuff like this. We've covered off Battle Royale 2, so we've covered off more Transformers, G1, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, 1981 TV series, and there's more to come with Blade Runner 2049. So
and of course 3 seasons of the Twilight Zone.
I was going to say, yeah, trekking
Like,
through the Twilight
wow.
Zone. We've done loads of stuff on that, which is fantastic. Some great episodes. So go check out the hours and hours of content you could get for just £5 a month. Loads and loads of content on there. So anyway, for now, this has been a long one. Hope you enjoyed it. And ladies and gentlemen, we shall see you on the next episode.